The headline hit like a thunderclap. Karoline Leavitt moves to cancel Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't whispered in the corners of political chatter. It was plastered across screens, echoed on timelines, reverberating through every feed like a digital siren. For one split second, it seemed as if Karoline had landed the punch that would define the week, the month, maybe even the year. But this was no ordinary headline. Beneath the surface of those words pulsed a current of venom, a tone that wasn't just about disagreement. It was about erasure. Karoline wasn't challenging Jasmine Crockett on policy or ideas. She was striking at her identity, her presence, her right to belong in the halls of power. To Karoline, the performance mattered more than the principle, and in that instant, she decided to play the role of executioner. The stage was set. Millions of Americans scrolled, stopped, and stared. Outrage swelled like a storm cloud. Did she really just say that? The question rippled across living rooms, coffee shops, and classrooms. Screens lit up not just with Karoline's words, but with the shock they carried. It wasn't just a tweet, it was a declaration of war. The digital guillotine dropped without hesitation. And yet something was different this time. Jasmine Crockett wasn't the kind of leader to shrink under the weight of somebody else's arrogance. She was no stranger to attempts at dismissal, no stranger to being underestimated. As Karoline's words spread like wildfire, Jasmine stood, in the eye of the storm, with a calm that only comes from knowing who you are, and knowing that truth cuts deeper than insult. People braced themselves for fallout. They expected silence, or maybe a carefully prepared statement in the language of damage control. That's how these things usually go. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to play by those rules. She understood something fundamental. When an opponent tries to define you, the most powerful response is to redefine the entire battlefield. And in that moment, as Karoline savored her digital strike, nobody could predict what would come next, because Jasmine Crockett had one move left. One simple, devastating, unforgettable move, and with a single tweet, she would flip the entire script. This wasn't just another online spat. To understand the weight of this moment, you had to see it against the backdrop of America's simmering cultural battle, a clash not just over policy, but over identity, dignity. And who gets to claim the mantle of authenticity in the public square? Karoline Leavitt had built her reputation on brashness. She thrived on confrontation, not persuasion. To her, politics wasn't about careful governance or patient debate. It was about spectacle, about grabbing the headline before anyone else could. Every soundbite was sharpened like a dagger. Every performance was crafted not for the halls of Congress, but for the endless scroll of social media. Her followers didn't tune in for policy details. They tuned in for the show, for the combativeness, for the sense that Karoline was always ready to pick a fight with someone, anyone who dared to stand in her way. But Jasmine Crockett was cut from a different cloth. She didn't need to manufacture a persona. She simply embodied it. Bold, yes, but never empty. She spoke the way people speak when they've lived the struggles they fight against. She carried herself with a groundedness that couldn't be faked. Her words didn't feel like they came from a focus group or a media consultant. They felt lived, real, undeniable. And in an era when so much of politics feels scripted, Jasmine's unapologetic authenticity stood out like a flare in the dark. That's why this clash mattered. It wasn't simply Karoline attacking Jasmine. It was performance trying to suffocate principle. It's arrogance trying to erase authenticity. Generational divides colliding head-on. Karoline represented a politics of theater, loud, divisive, endlessly, hungry for attention. Jasmine represented a politics of substance, confident, unafraid, and deeply rooted in the experiences of people who know what it means to fight for their seat at the table. So when Karoline tried to cancel Jasmine, it wasn't just one politician taking a swipe at another. It was a shot across the bow of every American who has ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or disappear. It was a moment that touched a nerve because it echoed so many stories beyond Washington. The stories of immigrants who fought to belong, of women who were underestimated, of young people told they had no place in leadership, and in that contrast, performance versus principle, theater versus truth, The stakes shot through the roof. Millions weren't just watching to see who would win a feud. They were watching to see if authenticity could finally stand its ground against arrogance. If dignity could win out against the cheap spectacle of cancellation. Karoline thought she had the upper hand. She believed the flash of her combative style would drown out Jasmine's presence. She believed the headline was hers to control. But when Karoline thought she had the upper hand, the tables began to turn. Karoline Leavitt didn't stumble into the spotlight. She sprinted toward it. Armed with sound bites and sharpened jabs, determined to make a name for herself in the gladiator arena of modern politics. From the beginning, she tethered herself to the MAGA brand, unapologetically loyal, defiantly combative, and always eager to prove that she could fight as hard or harder than anyone else on the stage. To her supporters, this brashness was refreshing. To her critics, it was reckless theater disguised as leadership. But one thing was clear: Karoline wasn't afraid to go low if it meant drawing headlines. Her rise was built on controversy, each step carefully choreographed to maximize visibility. She wasn't content with long policy debates or the slow grind of legislation. She craved the viral moment. Combative tweet here, a fiery TV appearance there. Her career became a string of provocations, designed to dominate the news cycle for a day or two before moving on to the next manufactured outrage. And in today's media landscape, that strategy worked. For a while, but beneath the surface of her calculated bravado, cracks began to show. Her attempts at cancellation, calling out opponents, branding them as unfit, un-American, or undeserving, didn't always land the way she hoped. Sometimes they even backfired spectacularly. Each time she aimed to erase someone else's credibility, she revealed something about herself. A reliance on performance over principle, a hunger for clout that overshadowed any deeper vision. There were moments when Karoline's attacks fizzled out, drawing ridicule instead of respect. Social media users began to notice the pattern. Her outrage felt too rehearsed, her indignation too convenient. She wielded her Twitter account like a sword, but more often than not, it swung wildly, cutting into her own credibility. And yet, she pressed on, convinced that louder always meant stronger. It was this overconfidence that set the stage for her confrontation with Jasmine Crockett. Karoline believed she had found her perfect target, a bold black woman who spoke her truth without apology, someone Karoline assumed could be caricatured, dismissed, or diminished. To Karoline, it was just another opportunity to score points, another headline to chase. She underestimated not only Jasmine's resolve, but also the audience watching from the sidelines. An America that had grown weary of the politics of cheap shots in her eagerness to cancel Jasmine. Karoline revealed the very weakness she had tried to hide, her reliance on performance. Because when the lights dimmed and the hashtags faded, there was little substance to hold on to. People began to see through the act, recognizing the pattern of outrage as just that, an act. And that was her greatest miscalculation. She assumed the script would play out like it always had. She'd launch her attack, claim the headline, and move on before anyone could question the shallowness beneath. This time her opponent wasn't just another political figure trying to weather the storm. This time, she was facing someone who understood the power of authenticity, someone who could meet spectacle with substance. What Karoline didn't see coming was the one weapon she could never disarm: authenticity. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin with privilege or prepackaged opportunity. It began with grit, determination, and the unshakable belief that she had as much right to a seat at the table as anyone else. Raised in an America that often tried to tell women like her to wait their turn, Jasmine refused to wait. She carved her own path with persistence that was as steady as it was fierce. Long before she entered Congress, Jasmine knew what it felt like to fight uphill battles. As a public defender, she stood shoulder to shoulder with people society had written off, defending those who couldn't afford a polished lawyer or a team of strategists. In crowded courtrooms where every voice seemed to drown out the poor and powerless, Jasmine made sure they were heard. That work left scars, but it also gave her strength. It taught her that arrogance could be beaten, that dismissal could be defied, and that authenticity, the kind rooted in lived struggle, was far more powerful than any slogan or stage performance. When she finally entered politics, she didn't come with the gloss of a carefully manufactured brand. She came with the raw honesty of someone who had seen injustice firsthand and couldn't stay silent. People recognized in her a reflection of themselves, the immigrant family trying to survive, the single parent balancing impossible loads. The young worker told their dreams were too big. She became a voice not because she sought attention, but because she carried the weight of stories America needed to hear. Jasmine was bold, unapologetically so. She spoke without the filters that turned so many politicians into talking points on two legs. But boldness doesn't mean recklessness. Her words weren't designed to shock for the sake of spectacle. They were rooted in conviction. Every sentence carried the rhythm of lived truth, the cadence of someone who had been underestimated but never undone. And that's what unsettled her opponents. For years, American politics had been dominated by performances, people more concerned with their next viral clip than with the communities they claimed to serve. Jasmine disrupted that entire playbook. She wasn't performing. She was testifying. She wasn't building a brand. She was carrying a legacy of resilience that stretched from the courthouse to Congress. It is precisely this authenticity that made her magnetic. When she walked into a room, she didn't have to demand attention. It came to her naturally, not because of theatrics, but because people could feel that she was real. In a world saturated with scripted outrage and political theater, Jasmine's refusal to play act was refreshing, even revolutionary. Her critics tried to paint her as too bold, too blunt, too unpolished. But what they failed to understand was that this was the source of her power. People didn't want another polished mask. They wanted someone unafraid to call things as they were, someone who didn't shrink when challenged, someone who didn't apologize for existing in a space long dominated by those who looked nothing like her. And that's why Karoline Leavitt's attack was so dangerous and so misguided. Karoline thought she could reduce Jasmine to a headline, dismiss her as easily as she had others before. What she didn't realize was that Jasmine's entire career had been built on surviving dismissal, on refusing to let arrogance erase her voice. The weight of her journey, from the courthouse to the halls of Congress, wasn't something that could be canceled with a snide remark or a viral post. Jasmine's story was already etched into the lives of the people she represented. Every attempt to silence her only amplified her voice. It was this authenticity, this unfiltered truth, carried from her roots to her rise, that turned her into more than just a politician. She became a symbol of resilience, of representation, of resistance against the arrogance of those who thought power gave them the right to define others, and it was this authenticity that made her next move so devastating. The confrontation began, like so many others in modern politics, with Karoline Leavitt smiling smugly into the camera, certain she had seized the spotlight. She delivered her accusations with the practiced rhythm of someone who had rehearsed every jab, every insinuation, every twist of the knife. Her tone dripped with condescension as she painted Jasmine Crockett not as a leader, not even as a peer, but as an interloper who dared to stand where, in Karoline's eyes, she didn't belong. The language was sharp, almost rehearsed, crafted for maximum outrage. She framed Jasmine as reckless, as undeserving, as the embodiment of everything she wanted her base to fear. It wasn't a debate, it was a performance. And Karoline, convinced of her own superiority, relished every moment of it. Online, the buzz began almost instantly. Supporters of Karoline cheered her on, flooding comment sections with applause, emojis, and fire icons. But just as quickly, a countercurrent began to flow. Viewers raised eyebrows, shaking their heads at the sheer arrogance on display. For every cheer, there was a gasp of disbelief. For every supporter celebrating Karoline's theatrics, there was another voice asking the same question. Why is she attacking Jasmine this way? In real time, the clash became less about what was said and more about what it represented. Karoline's approach felt like a courtroom prosecutor trying to bury her opponent under a stack of accusations. But Jasmine wasn't flustered. She didn't fumble for words or raise her voice in retaliation. Instead, she sat steady, listening, allowing Karoline's bluster to echo in the air like a hollow drum beat. That composure was its own kind of power. While Karoline leaned forward, gesturing wildly, Jasmine leaned back. Her expression calm, her silence cutting deeper than any outburst ever could. Viewers noticed. Contrast was stark. One woman desperate to dominate, the other quietly holding her ground, and the longer Jasmine stayed composed, the more obvious Karoline's performance became. What had started as a confident strike began to look like overcompensation. Her tone grew shriller, her accusations more desperate, her confidence starting to fray around the edges. For all her bluster, Karoline couldn't shake the reality that her opponent wasn't breaking. Jasmine wasn't rattled. She wasn't giving her the satisfaction of flinching. That's when the tide of public perception began to shift. On social media, the split screen told its own story. Karoline, animated and smug, versus Jasmine.com and unbothered. Memes were already forming in real time, side-by-side comparisons. Captions pointing out the dignity of stillness versus the chaos of arrogance. Hashtags began to appear, subtle at first but growing louder with every passing minute, and in the midst of it all, Jasmine waited. She wasn't going to match Karoline's theatrics with more theatrics. She understood the power of timing, the impact of restraint. She let Karoline talk herself into a corner, piling accusation on top of accusation until the words collapsed under their own weight. Finally, as the moment reached its boiling point, Jasmine made her move. Not with a speech, not with an angry rebuttal, but with something far sharper, far more devastating. Because while Karoline was busy performing for the cameras, Jasmine was preparing something else. Something that wouldn't just answer the attack, but would redefine the entire confrontation. The air was tense. The audience leaning in, the timeline brimming with anticipation. And then, with a single action that would reverberate far beyond that room, Jasmine struck. But then came the tweet heard across America. The silence before it landed was almost unbearable. Karoline had finished her tirade, leaning back with the self-satisfied smirk of someone convinced she had won. The chatter online was at fever pitch. Supporters applauded her ferocity. Critics recoiled at her arrogance. But everyone's supporters, skeptics, casual observers, was waiting for one thing. Jasmine's response. People refreshed their feeds, fingers twitching on their phones. They weren't just watching, they were holding their breath. Would Jasmine release a long, defensive statement? Would she go on television to explain herself? Would she even bother responding at all? In those moments of anticipation, the tension felt cinematic, like the world was waiting for a verdict. And then it came. Not a rambling thread, not a polished press release. Just one tweet. Clean, sharp, devastating. Jasmine typed it, hit send, and the digital world erupted. The words were simple. They cut through every ounce of noise Karoline had manufactured. A witty one-liner that reframed the entire clash. It didn't just respond to the accusations, it dismantled them. It exposed Karoline's attack as hollow, petty, and desperate. It reminded people of Jasmine's strength, her authenticity, her refusal to be erased. And in its brevity, it carried the punch of 1,000 speeches. Screens lit up across America. Notifications poured in. Within minutes, the tweet had been shared thousands of times. Then an hour, it was everywhere on Instagram stories, TikTok slideshows, Facebook posts, late-night group chats. It was the kind of message that didn't just silence a critic. It elevated the person who wrote it. The crowd online erupted. Memes popped up in real time, each one celebrating Jasmine's precision strike. GIFs of mic drops, standing ovations, and shocked expressions spread like wildfire. Commentators piled on. That's how it's done. She ended her with one line. Game over. For Jasmine's supporters, it wasn't just a political win. It was vindication. It was proof that dignity and wit could triumph over arrogance and noise. Karoline, meanwhile, faltered. For the first time, the smile slipped. She hadn't expected this. She thought Jasmine would scramble, stumble, try to defend herself with a flurry of explanations. Instead, Jasmine's one tweet flipped the narrative so completely that Karoline looked not like the aggressor, but like the one exposed. Her replies, when they came, were scattered and defensive. They didn't land. they didn't matter. Because by then, the story had already been written, and Jasmine was the author. The brilliance of the moment wasn't just in the words themselves, but in the contrast. Karoline had spent paragraphs trying to tear Jasmine down. Jasmine responded with a single sentence that carried more weight than Karoline's entire performance. It was the purest distillation of authenticity versus theater, substance versus spectacle, and that contrast resonated. People across the country saw, in Jasmine's tweet, a reflection of something bigger. The idea that you don't need to shout to be heard, that truth doesn't need embellishment to shine. For those who had ever been dismissed, mocked, or underestimated, the tweet felt personal. It was more than a comeback. It was a statement of survival. As the hours passed, the impact only grew. News outlets picked it up, talk shows replayed it, podcasts dissected it. The tweet became a cultural artifact in real time. A moment that crystallized the entire debate and ensured Jasmine's voice wouldn't just be remembered, but celebrated. And still, the energy didn't wane. Every retweet, every meme, every cheer echoed the same sentiment. Jasmine had not just defended herself, she had won. She had taken Karoline's attempt at cancellation and turned it into a stage for her own triumph. For Karoline, the silence that followed was damning. Every attempt to claw back the narrative only emphasized how thoroughly she had been outmaneuvered. The smirk that had once looked confident now seemed brittle. The theatrics that once drew applause now looked desperate. And as Jasmine's words continued to reverberate, Karoline's bluster dissolved into background noise. The showdown had begun with arrogance, but it ended with clarity. One leader shouting for attention, another commanding it with poise. One trying to erase the other, writing herself deeper into the story of American politics. And yet, the true measure of Jasmine's victory wasn't just in the moment itself. It was in what came next. Because as the tweet circled the globe, the ripple effects were only beginning to show, but the shockwaves had only just begun. The tweet didn't just land, it detonated. Within minutes, Twitter's trending page lit up like a fireworks display. Jasmine's name climbing to the top alongside hashtags that spread with lightning speed. Hashtag Crockett clap back. Hashtag truth over theatrics. Hashtag mic drop moment. What had begun as one woman's reply to arrogance quickly transformed into a collective roar of approval from across the country. Social media platforms became theaters of celebration. On TikTok, creators stitched together dramatic readings of Jasmine's tweet, setting it to epic soundtracks, overlaying it with slow-motion effects, and racking up millions of views overnight. Instagram Reels showed fans reenacting the exchange. With comic exaggeration, Karoline huffing and puffing, Jasmine calmly delivering the fatal line. Even on Facebook, where political conversations often feel heavy and polarized, Jasmine's words were shared across generational divides. Grandparents posting it with the same enthusiasm as college students. The momentum spilled over into mainstream media. Late-night hosts couldn't resist the story. Clips of Jasmine's one-liner became punchlines for monologues. The audience laughing not just at the humor, but at the truth embedded in her words. Podcasters dissected the confrontation, some with scholarly seriousness, others with gleeful fandom. Commentators who rarely agreed on anything found common ground in their acknowledgement. Jasmine had delivered the political knockout punch of the season. Even her rivals, grudgingly or otherwise, had to tip their hats. Conservative strategists, appearing on cable news panels, admitted that Karoline had walked straight into a trap of her own making. You can't outplay authenticity, one remarked, visibly irritated by the concession. Liberal commentators, meanwhile, celebrated Jasmine not just as a victor in a debate, but as a symbol of resilience. This is what it looks like when dignity fights back, one pundit declared. But it wasn't just the pundits and professionals who kept the moment alive. It was everyday people. Hashtags turned into movements. Teachers printed Jasmine's tweet and taped it to classroom bulletin boards as an example of confidence under fire. College students wore it on t-shirts at rallies. Parents used it as a talking point at dinner tables, explaining to their children how sometimes the strongest response isn't the loudest, but the truest. The ripple effects reached into unexpected corners of culture. Musicians referenced it in lyrics. Artists painted it on murals. A coffee shop in Dallas even renamed one of its drinks the Crockett, a nod to the congresswoman whose wit had outshone arrogance. Karoline's misstep, meanwhile, only deepened. Every attempt to claw back attention looked smaller next to Jasmine's growing legend. When she tried to double down with another round of insults, the internet barely flinched. The energy had shifted, and no amount of theatrics could redirect it. The more she talked, the more irrelevant she seemed. For Jasmine, the win was more than personal, it was cultural. She hadn't just defeated an opponent in a fleeting argument. She had sparked a conversation about what kind of leadership people craved. The overwhelming reaction made it clear. Americans were tired of the politics of performance. They wanted authenticity. They wanted leaders who could stand in their truth without apology, who didn't hide behind spectacle, who didn't crumble when attacked. And in that realization, the clash between Jasmine and Karoline became more than a trending moment. It became a turning point. People weren't just celebrating a clever tweet, they were rallying behind the idea it represented, that authenticity is not weakness, that resilience is not silence, and that even in a noisy world, the sharp ring of truth carries farther than the loudest shout. The memes, the laughter, the applause, all of it was only the surface. Beneath the viral celebration, something deeper was happening. Shift was taking root, subtle but undeniable. Yet beyond the memes and hashtags, something deeper was unfolding. When the noise of the moment finally began to fade, what remained wasn't just the memory of a sharp comeback. It was the clarity of a truth that stretched far beyond politics, a truth that resonated with millions who had followed the clash. Authenticity triumphs over arrogance. Every single time, Karoline had entered the fight armed with noise, grandstanding, posturing, the brittle armor of performance. She had believed that the louder voice, the sharper insult, the bigger spectacle would carry the day. But what her defeat revealed was the emptiness of that strategy. Spectacle may dominate a headline, but it doesn't endure. Noise may drown, out-reason for a moment, but it cannot replace justice. Jasmine's victory wasn't built on theatrics. It was built on dignity. She didn't scramble to match Karoline's volume or sink to her level. She stood in her truth, unshaken, unfiltered, and undeniably real. That stillness, that refusal to perform for the cameras, became her greatest strength. And in that strength, people across America saw themselves. Their struggles, their resilience, their quiet insistence on being heard in a world that too often tries to silence them. It became clear that this was never just about two women in a political skirmish. It was about the clash between two visions of leadership, one rooted in performance where the aim is to dominate through noise and spectacle, the other rooted in authenticity, where leadership is about carrying the weight of real lives and real struggles without apology. And when the dust settled, it was authenticity that stood tall. Jasmine's composure reminded us that justice doesn't need to shout to be heard. Her wit reminded us that truth, when spoken plainly, is more powerful than any insult. Her victory reminded us that dignity, when held firm, cannot be canceled. For every immigrant who has been told they don't belong, for every young person dismissed as too inexperienced, for every woman underestimated in the rooms of power, Jasmine's moment was a reminder. You don't have to bend to arrogance. You don't have to play the game of performance. Sometimes the strongest move is to stand in your truth and let it speak for itself. That is why the moment mattered so much. It wasn't just a viral tweet. It was a reflection of something universal. It was about the kind of leaders we want, the kind of values we cherish, the kind of America we strive to build. In America, where dignity is louder than derision, where authenticity outlasts performance, where justice carries the final word. And as people replayed Jasmine's words, as they shared them and celebrated them, they weren't only applauding her wit. They were affirming their own belief in a better politics, a better culture, a better way forward. Because in the end, what echoed wasn't Karoline's noise, it was Jasmine's truth. A truth that cut through the spectacle. A truth that resonated far beyond one political skirmish. Truth that left an imprint on the national conversation, and in the end, one simple tweet carried a lesson for us all. Karoline Leavitt attempted to cancel Jasmine Crockett, but instead, she canceled herself. What was meant to be a takedown became a masterclass in resilience, a reminder that arrogance always crumbles in the face of authenticity. In one tweet, Jasmine didn't just defend herself. She turned the entire narrative on its head and showed the country what real leadership looks like. This is why her victory mattered. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about proving that dignity speaks louder than noise, that truth resonates longer than performance, and that no amount of theater can erase the power of authenticity. Once a time when so much of politics feels like spectacle, Jasmine's triumph reminded us that substance still matters, that courage still carries weight. If you believe dignity will always win over derision, if you believe authenticity will always outlast arrogance, then Jasmine's story is your story too. Her victory is a reflection of the fight so many of us face every day. Being underestimated, being dismissed, being told we don't belong. And yet, like Jasmine, we rise, we stand, and we refuse to be silenced. That's why we tell these stories. Because they remind us not only of who our leaders are, but of who we are. Strong, resilient, unapologetic. So if you felt inspired by Jasmine Crockett's triumph, if you want more stories where authenticity defeats arrogance, where dignity rises above cancel culture, then join us. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because this isn't just a channel. It's a movement to celebrate the voices that refuse to be silenced. Because in the end, one simple tweet carried a lesson for us all. The story is only just beginning.